Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, and this is your weekly episode of Psychedelics Weekly. We're here with David Drapkin. We're recording on May 24th, and this will be released on May 26th. David, how you doing today, man?
I'm pretty good. Yeah. I've been a bit ill with sinus infection, so I've started taking drugs. I was trying not to. I like drugs, but not the kind that are antibiotics. So yeah, I've given in, and it's going to help me feel better. But yeah, I got to see you last week in Manhattan, and
which was
that
fun.
was lovely. Yeah, we had a nice time together, mate.
Yeah, and for a little bit of context, me and David were in Manhattan for a little kind of mastermind group for Teachable. That's the platform that we use to host our classes and courses on, and it was a nice kind of like little event to get together with other creators and educators in the space, and just it was fun. I really enjoyed it. It's cool to get to know some of the folks behind the software that we've been using for a very long time. So it was really great.
Yeah, there were some good characters there, some other creators, and there was one guy that had 3 Porsches. He's kind of used to work with Gary V, and it was really fun speaking to these guys who've like just earned loads of money and they're kind of semi-retired. It's like, so what do you do with semi-retirement? And well, I just drive my Porsches and go to nice restaurants. And I was like, is that it? it's like, yeah, it's great. I love it. It's like, oh, wow, I don't think I'd do that if I was retired. I'd hope I'd be a bit more, proactive in doing creative spiritual endeavors and non-profits, but who knows, maybe I would just drive a Porsche and eat fancy food.
Well, then on the flip side, the other guy tried to retire and he got too bored hanging out on the beach. So, I think those early retirement things, you probably have your honeymoon phase and then you realize you get pretty bored and need something else to focus on. But yeah, it was cool. And I think it was a good reminder too for me. We always say, go to psychedelic meetups, go to psychedelic events, meet the others. But for me, this is also really important to just network with other people outside of our field and industry, and just learn what other people are doing. So I'm like, okay, maybe we need to do that a little bit more too, and find other events that are within our interests and skills, and just meet others. It's sometimes nice to kind of step outside your little bubble.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I really enjoyed that too.
Yeah. All right, well, before we kick things off here for Psychedelics Weekly, just a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel on there as well. If you've been mostly audio-based, we have been posting many of our interviews on YouTube, so go check that out. I don't know if we have any other updates around education events and stuff, so yeah, let's kick things off here. So this first article that we'll dig into and explore is called "Psychedelic Workers of the World Unite" by Jules Evans. This is a really interesting article and really kind of explores what therapists, guides, trip sitters are facing with challenges, difficulties in the field, and also maybe underappreciated and exploited in a lot of different areas. Jules has been putting out some really interesting articles over the past few months I think we've been covering, and also highlights, kind of like these little shadow aspects of the field, and I think really kind of important to emphasize and explore at times.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying what Jules is writing lately. His website's ecstaticintegration.org. It's got, I think you can subscribe to it as well. And there's tons in this article, so I think this is probably the meatiest article we're going to dive into this week.
I think so.
And overall, realizing that it is the practitioner that's doing the work that is in the most challenging and kind of risky space in the whole ecosystem here. They're putting more on the line than anyone else. They have most to lose than anyone else. So there's a lot of lessons that we need to be learning, and just a lot of care and sensitivity and slowness I think we need to be taking in this field just to look after ourselves.
Totally.
One of the first point that the article raised was around the newness of the industry. A lot of young people that are launching companies, and it's a very hip, fashionable industry. So there's a lot of young people that are kind of moving in and wanting to change the world, which is great. And at the same time, we just really need some kind of wise heads, elders that have been there and done it before, to really help us be grounded and humble and just slow down a little bit what we're trying to do, just moving at the pace of trust. And I just interviewed Ros Watts yesterday, so you'll hear that podcast soon, hopefully. And she's really talking a lot about elders at the moment, and really needing to kind of lean into those people and find those people and listen to those voices, just to keep us humble. So for me, that was a really big takeaway.
Yeah, so Jules highlights 6 different challenges that we're exploring together as a field. And yeah, this first point is about lack of elders and lack of experience. And I was actually just talking about this last night in my study group, just around slowing down and finding good mentors and elders to work with. And I was sharing a little bit of my personal experience when I started my journey in wanting to study psychedelics. And I was definitely, very glossy-eyed, starry-eyed, like, oh my God, this is going to save the world. And I came across some really great mentors that kind of checked me throughout the years. And I think they saw that in me, right? They're like, yeah, you're not going to save the world, Kyle. Like, slow down. And at first, it really kind of like, one particular person, it just, it felt like they were always trying to like slow me down and hit the brakes. And I would get really annoyed at it. But I've really appreciated it over the years. I find that that's exactly what I needed, because I had this excitement, and I'm just so thankful that I actually had really great mentors along the way to help kind of brake check me. Because we can get dazzled by these big insights and these truths that we need to be doing this work immediately. And how do we just slow down and be a little bit more patient? Because, what harm can we cause if we are just running very quickly and we don't have a lot of training and we lack a lot of experience? So it's an important reminder. And I think a lot of people, and sometimes, I felt this throughout the years, it's like, if you don't act now, you're going to miss the boat, right? And it feels like this psychedelic ship has just set sail, and it's like, oh no, we got to I need to make my place there, right? And it's okay. Like, things are still just starting. It's still just starting. And it doesn't feel like that, right? It feels like, oh, maybe I've already missed my opportunity. I need to jump in and do all this stuff quickly. But it's a good reminder to slow down, take your time. There's still so much progress. We're just at the beginning, folks. It's like, we're still just here. But there's a really great quote here by Dr. Ros Watts. And she said, so much of what I see it's happening in the psychedelic space is because we're lacking the checks and balances that come when we have a circle of wise elders who let go of their personal ambitions for power and instead able to provide direction, counsel, guidance, conflict resolution, transformative justice, learning. The Western psychedelic field is young, bold, determined, laden with treasures too powerful for naive hands to hold. That is a quote right there. Big dreams, big hype, a lot to prove, a lot to heal, a world to save. So much at stake, so much to win: power, money, status, popularity, being special, and being seen as a healer. So ego inflation, problems brushed under the carpet, stress, pressure, polarization, projection, denial, manipulation, factions. Everyone's calling everyone a narcissist, competition, scapegoating, ruptures without repair. We need help. And no wonder we're cut off from our roots. We lack lineage, apprenticeship, and spaces for reflecting and acknowledging mistakes and course correcting and laughing and crying together. That's some really great points there. And we've seen a lot of that, right? We've seen a lot of like the polarization, kind of the infighting over the years, different agendas. Some people want to go really fast and, create this new system. Other people want to, do their due diligence and really work slowly so we don't make the same mistakes. And you definitely, I feel, Like you feel that sometimes, right?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing quote by Ross Watts. It's almost like a photograph snapshot of a time in history of the psychedelic renaissance of where we are right now. That is a really accurate, multidimensional reality. And I think one of the other pieces in the article by Jules Evans, there were two others actually. So there's 6 main points. There's 2 that kind of go on from what you were just saying, Carl. One was about burnout and clashes with management and tensions with the corporatization of psychedelics, similar to what you're saying. And that desire to do good and heal the world, well, that can lead to burnout, both what our intentions are and not looking after ourselves. And so there's a figure that is in here looking at a survey that was done with 29 therapists and guides. 60% said they had some burnout. 27% said they had a lot of burnout. So 87% had burnout of one kind or another there. And, that's, I can just from a normal therapist experience, I worked in an outpatient mental health center and, they were pushing me so hard. For a couple of years, I was seeing like 30 patients in a week, like half an hour break. And that was it. In an 8-hour day, half an hour break, no time for documentation, no supervision, just see those patients and then bill them and make lots of money for us. And it was hard going, and there are psychedelic companies that are doing the same thing. And this article mentioned, in particular, Mindbloom, and how much they're paying their clinicians and the pressure to have, 2 4-hour shifts with a 30-minute break in between, literally. So exactly what I just said. And also Field Trip, it mentioned, they spent tons of money in their centers on chairs and carpets and paintings and plants. And I went to the one in Manhattan. Oh my, it was like being in a modern art museum. Beautiful. So they spent all that money on their kind of decor, the setting. But when it came down to looking after clinicians, they were really burned out. Like pressure to see more clients, and similar thing to what Dan Kamen said, and he's in this article about Synthesis and other folks who are at Synthesis. As soon as they start to get into financial trouble, they were like, okay, well, let's take some of your breaks out. Let's increase how many shifts you're doing. Let's, have more retreats happening here, less downtime, less supervision, and it's like that's not sustainable. So we're really trying to figure out what's a model that is sustainable, that keeps clients safe, but just doesn't take advantage of really good intentioned clinicians here.
Yeah, and they made a note here around Field Trip, and other companies doing this as well, not just Field Trip, but just even kind of cutting the cost of the therapist and saying the therapist was too expensive, and maybe taking that outside of the treatment, which for most of us that have been around for a while, maybe our biases leak in here and say, I don't know, maybe you should have like a good sitter therapist in the room for you when you're working with this, right? But some IV clinics, they may just leave somebody in there and say, we don't need to do psychotherapy. But what happens when somebody has really big experiences? And so that does bring up the question around how do you scale psychedelics appropriately? I think from the therapist perspective, you have to do it very cautiously. From, management perspective, they're really looking at numbers most of the time and like how to, do more. And I think there's always going to be that clash unless we kind of can find like a good system. And I always come back and, this isn't like, I think this quote that I'm about to say, and I've probably said it a few times on the podcast in the past, doesn't work for the models that we work in. And I think it came from Michael Harner. Our teacher Lenny always mentioned it. And he said, Michael Harner one time said in a workshop or a lecture somewhere that shamanism was a part-time job. They usually had another role in the community. And when somebody would get sick, they'd go to the shaman. The shaman wasn't on like doing that round the clock 24/7. And again, we're looking at smaller communities of people and obviously that would be a little bit part-time. But I always come back to that statement. And how much can you really take on as a healer? How much can you take on as a therapist? And being really honest with yourself and having the self-awareness to be like, wow, this vicarious trauma that I'm taking on with my clients is actually really ravaging my nervous system. Wow, I've been seeing back to back to back to back clients. I'm not actually taking care of myself. Like, I find it really interesting in a field that promotes so much self-care and looking after yourself. Therapists don't always do that, right? Because sometimes it's the clash with management, with agencies needing to continue to have clients, have those numbers come in. And then sometimes we don't always take our own advice. And we have to remind ourselves, like, doing psychedelic therapy is going to be long. And how many sessions can you actually do a week? And sometimes if you're at a retreat and maybe you can do that, a couple sessions during the week. But then I know this article also highlighted some issues with young people working at retreats, like just working around the clock, months on end. They're away from families. Like, it's just like the session after session after session, and really thinking about, like, how much can you really hold? How much other people's energy and traumas can you hold? And do you have your own good self-care techniques? Do you have the techniques to have energetic hygiene, to kind of brush a lot of that stuff off, shake it out of your nervous system?
Yeah, hugely important. Really, really big questions. The cost of living's sky high, and I know a lot of healers and guides and clinicians out there are, just pushing themselves too hard. Quite a few people are doing a day job Monday to Friday, and then at the weekend they're doing a Cambo or ayahuasca ceremony, and they're doing that every weekend. And it's I don't know how they do it. And I think it also brings us to another question around the legal and financial risks, and that was one of the 6 pieces here. And again, it's the clinician, the practitioner, the guide, the healer that is most legally and financially exposed here, because it's very hard to get insurance for doing guiding work or clinical work.
There is no insurance, right?
So how do we know that? Like, do we know what the laws are? Are we consciously making this decision? I am going to do this thing that if things go pear-shaped, I could get into a lot of legal and financial trouble. What kind of formal decision-making process are we really going into? Because there's just so much uncertainty. You never know what's actually potentially going to happen. So you can't plan it like, it's going to be okay. I know what I'm doing. It's virtually impossible to say that. And I think the other piece that it taps into in this article was around just the importance of adverse events and safety and screening. And in a clinical setting, the assessment piece, the screening piece is really, really key. And you need that so that you can, assign them to an appropriate level of care and then get reimbursed by insurance companies for the services you delivered, and you have a diagnosis code to get, paid. But when you're working in psychedelic therapy, that doesn't exist yet. So I think there is that tendency for some people just to skip through the assessment piece, to think, it's okay, it's safe, I know this person, they're normal, they're healthy, they can take this, let's just do it. And to not go through that really, again, slow, gradual, patient process of exploring the why are you here, and what are some of the risk factors. And without that screening piece, I think particularly for underground practitioners, there's just a lot of risk factors that they're exposing themselves to, even though their intentions may well be good.
Mm-hmm. There's 2 points that they highlighted here in this adverse and concerns about safety. And the one bullet point is, we'll say, this is a quote: "Sometimes there's genuine emergencies which require professional medical support, but inexperienced guides won't recognize that and will tend to spiritualize everything as, quote, part of the process." And that is so important to realize, guys. Like, not everything is a spiritual process or part of the process. And so they go on to share that there were 2 accidental deaths in the Australian New Age scene, both involving Cambo. The secretion from the tree frog, they burn a tiny bit of the top layer of the skin off, they apply it, not really psychedelic, psychoactive. The two involving Cambo, one involving ayahuasca, and in neither case were emergency services called promptly. And in the ayahuasca ceremony, when medics did arrive, they were told by facilitators they were interfering with the person's aura. I think that's one of the risks when we tend to spiritualize everything and kind of put it in that framework. And I talk about this pretty often when I give presentations and talk about spiritual emergencies. And I think, there's a really great quote by Stan Groff saying, there is a risk of really romanticizing these different states of consciousness. And we have to be really critical and assess if there's actually anything biologically, physically going on with somebody. Sometimes, yes, a spiritual experience and a big process might look medical, and maybe it is just part of the process. But, how do we get enough education around, medical emergencies, and how do we identify that? And that's super, super important. Just even you talking a little bit about legal financial risks, just even thinking about the pressure that puts on people. Like, it's probably like in the back of the mind, right? If you're working in the underground, like, do you fully trust the person? You're engaging in illegal activity. How does that sit within you? I feel like I would always be a little bit on edge, just knowing that. And so also thinking about like how that's affecting you and how it's probably showing up in sessions as well.
Yeah. Working in that gray zone in the underground creates just a lot of challenges around how to do this safely, transparently. And even if it's just getting some more medical help, like there's that perverse incentive, can I do that? I'm putting myself on the line here. And there are Samaritan laws, at least in New Jersey where I am. If someone is using heroin, say, and their friend overdoses, that they can call the ambulance, police, and they won't get in trouble for using heroin or possessing heroin, because they're using emergency services to help that person. So that's been put into a law here. Doesn't exist for people that are doing underground ceremonies with ayahuasca or DMT though.
Right. And that's a reason why most people don't call medical services, right? Knowing that they are doing something that's illegal, it's in the underground, not wanting to get, the police or medical folks involved, because then you're running the risk of, hey, I'm offering this service and this is what I'm doing and this is what happened, right?
Good article. Anything else there you wanted to tap into?
So there's just one more point, and then we'll recap the points again. The last point that Jules touched on was just the concept of transference and countertransference, and how a lot of people, especially if you don't have any sort of psychological training, if you got your degree in psychology, mental health, etc. Maybe you don't have training around transference and countertransference. And even if you do have like a grad degree and some of that, I don't know, my grad program briefly touched on it, but there weren't like any classes that went really in depth in how to deal with, these types of interactions. So transference, referring to a client developing feelings for therapists or and really projecting those roles onto them. And then countertransference, referring to the therapist being triggered by the transference of the client and projecting their own issues onto the client. And so really being aware of this dynamic that's happening in sessions, because that stuff gets amplified, right? Like all that material comes to the surface, and then say, you're having a session and then all of a sudden, as the participant, some old motherhood trauma came up, and the guide is a female therapist, and then all of a sudden it's like, all this mother stuff comes up. You're projecting it on a therapist, could trigger more fear, more anxiety, maybe not wanting to really share things, and then as the therapist, it's like you're feeling that. Then how do you deal with that, right? Do you have training in some of that stuff? Do you work with it appropriately? Do you ignore it? And there's a lot of issues that can really happen, especially boundary issues, right? And I think that's like the one thing that really comes up is boundary breaches, inappropriate sexual relations with clients. What happens when some of that sexual energy comes up in sessions and you don't have training in good ethics and boundaries, and maybe you play into it a little bit. So, this is the other part that, I think a lot of, people that are just getting involved in the field maybe aren't having training in. And I think it's really important.
Transference and countertransference does come up more often when using psychedelics. It's supposed to, it's often coming, from the unconscious, and it comes from, a place that needs to be seen and heard and felt and processed with someone else. So it's actually, a really fertile part of the healing process, and it's also, really challenging to kind of be able to hold that, without, reacting in a more destructive way. Yeah, so it's hugely challenging.
Yeah. So again, these 6 points that Jules highlighted here in this article, and definitely go check it out. The website was ecstaticintegration.org. Lack of elders and lack of experience, transference and countertransference, adverse events and concerns about safety and screening, legal and financial risks, clashes with management, and then the sixth one is burnout. And I think the other point that was made with lack of elders and lack of experience, I don't know if we really mentioned it, but how long it actually takes to really kind of get to know this work. And, a lot of people, we do want to get trained quickly, right? But this work takes a very long time, right? If we think about how people were traditionally trained, it took years, decades sometimes, to really kind of understand the work. And if for those that do hold professional licenses, how long did it take you to get trained in your trade? So can you learn this type of training in like a 3-month program? Probably not. I always come back to like my breathwork training, and I think I ended up doing about 4 years of training and experience before I even thought about putting on a workshop for somebody else. And there's the eager part of me was like, I want to get, done with this very quickly. And there are those weekend trainings where you get trained in some sort of breathwork technique and, go out and do it within a weekend. But to really know all the nuances, to really feel comfortable, there are, again, people that are gifted. They have tons of other life experiences that really brought them there. And some people can step into the work pretty early. But, also taking the long game too, I think is really important. Slowing down, really being mindful and self-aware of, where your limits are, your scope of practice, and just being truthful to yourself. Like, what can you actually do? And sometimes that's hard. Again, like I went through it, and I was really happy I had good mentors and teachers early on that slowed me down, because I was just like, I need to do this right away. And, they're like, pump the brakes, Kyle, pump the brakes.
Yeah. You've had some great mentors and elders in your life. It's awesome. Really awesome.
I feel very fortunate to just have good mentors and elders around, for sure.
All right, so that was our meaty article. Now we get to go on to, the veg. We've got loads of other articles. Let's see how many we can cram in. The next one is an article from thelantern.com. Its title is Ohio State becomes the first American university to be granted DEA license for psychedelic mushroom growth. It's by Kate Shields. I didn't know that. So it's really good to hear. And it doesn't go into really fine details of what the studies are going to look at, but it really, to me, just sounds like they want to grow mushrooms and experiment on them and really get to know them better, like different hypotheses about, what is this? Where does this magic lie? And one of the things that particularly I like they're asking is to explore the therapeutic potential of natural compared to synthetic psilocybin. I don't know that that's been done enough yet, so I'm particularly interested in that piece. How about you, Carl?
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I originally saw this news from, I think, a student that's pursuing their MSW over at Ohio, and I was just like, whoa, that feels like news. So that was really cool to hear. So I'll read a little bit from this article here. So Ohio State recently became the first American university to be awarded a license by the DEA to grow whole mushrooms for research purposes, including studying the relationships between mental health treatment and psychedelics and identifying species-specific chemicals. So that sounds pretty cool to start kind of cataloging, what's in maybe all the different kind of molecules and chemicals in mushrooms. And the license was given in partnership with Interstate, a mental health and wellness research and development company focused on psychedelics. Yeah, it's just cool to hear the DEA actually provided license for this. I think Dr. Sue Sisley received some sort of DEA approval for cultivating mushrooms, but I don't know if that was attached to a university or if that was just with her business and her personally.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. But it's great, I think it's great I think we know some of the answers to these questions, and it's good just to formally kind of jump through the hoops. And at the same time, we don't really know all of the answers because a lot of the really, clinical scientific research is being done in a more kind of corporate way or clinical trial way, whereas this seems to just really be looking at the mushrooms themselves, which I think's, let's start there. Yeah.
And then there is an emphasis that this license does not allow for any sort of distribution of mushrooms to anyone. So it'll just be strictly research oriented, which, but still awesome that people are able to be able to do that within a university. And of all places, Ohio, you wouldn't expect that. You'd figure somewhere, I don't know, the Bay Area or somewhere in California, Oregon, or Colorado. So super cool. But I know they do have a pretty robust psychedelic program over there. Dr. Alan Davis is over there and a few others. So I think that helped to really kind of help to streamline that a bit, I'm guessing.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So congrats, everybody, over there.
Yeah, good news. All right, so swiftly moving on. The next article is from a website called thedebrief.org, and it's titled New Research Reveals LSD's Mind-Altering Power to Enhance Learning and Exploratory Thinking. It's by Tim McMillan. What did you get from this article, Carl?
It was pretty interesting to hear some research around how LSD could enhance learning, exploratory thinking. I think for some folks, this may feel kind of new, or hey, maybe some of this has been done before, right? I think about some of Fadiman's research and kind of creative problem solving, and trying to explore this, and also has me a little bit more excited around the potential around maybe exploring these things for non-clinical use cases. I always come back to something that Stan Groff said, suggesting that the real potential in psychedelics could be for creativity, and the need for creativity for solving all these problems that we're facing in the world. So the aim of the study was to understand the effects of LSD on learning and decision making in humans. There was 19 participants, and they use a task called probabilistic reversal learning, PLR, to assess people's choices under conditions of uncertainty and to measure the participants' behavior in response to feedback of their choices. Each participant was in both conditions: one IV LSD with a dose of 75 micrograms in a saline solution, and then IV placebo in a saline solution, with sessions being at least 2 weeks apart from one another.
Yeah.
So some of the results, those given LSD learned more quickly from their experience compared when given to the placebo when the feedback is given. The LSD group showed more exploration compared to placebo, and LSD heightened sensitivity to positive as well as negative feedback. So,
yeah, and this was 75 micrograms, so yeah, kind of medium moderate dose. One of the things that I got from the article was that it's tapping into and reinforcing what appears to be a pretty common theme that a lot of research is coming up with in the psychedelics realm around, neuropsychiatry, is that pattern of rigid thinking and rumination, and how psychedelics, shake up the snow globe in a way. And particularly in this piece, it's talking about the ability to shift thinking and responses once a pattern is changed. How soon do you notice that the pattern has changed, and how open are you to kind of developing a new pattern? And I think that's a really interesting concept for us to use in real life. Like, I think it's so easy to just get used to life being quite monotonous and rigid, and not noticing kind of when it's necessary to change old behavioral patterns, and to respond to just changes in external reality that require us to kind of put on a different hat, or to use a different approach. And I think LSD in particular has that ability, it seems, to enable us to just be a little bit more malleable in our patterns of behavior and thinking and perception and responding to external stimuli and kind of just internal belief systems. To be honest, I think this comes down to internal belief systems a lot, and in a sense just being a bit brave in trusting self to try new things and to take a step into unknown realms a little bit. So I'm definitely over-interpreting these results, but that's what I read into it on my own level. How about you? If you were going to over-interpret it, Kyle, where would you go with it, mate?
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I mean, I think about some of the early research with, this is your brain on psilocybin, and it's showing all the interconnectedness and being able to step outside of ourselves a bit, open up these new neural networks, these new pathways, for new ways of thinking. And I think, it is fascinating. The other thing I'm also thinking about, and just looking at this statement here, that LSD heightens sensitivity to positive as well as negative feedback. And this is something I explored on the podcast a number of years ago with Robin Carhart Harris, and I think maybe a few others. I've brought it up here and there. But, we always talk about neuroplasticity as like a really positive thing. And I always come back to something Dr. Dan Siegel suggests. I guess he took it from somebody else. I always forget the original author of this quote. But neurons that fire together wire together. And what happens when we do have negative experiences? And that starts to become a new loop. And so, I was exploring a little bit of this idea is like, what if you had a really negative trip, and you started seeing and I think I was using the example of HPPD, for example. And now this is a new way of seeing the world. And then, you can't shut that off for a bit, right? And then what happens if you start to then encode these new neural pathways with more negativity? And so it's just interesting that they highlighted they were more open to negative feedback, whereas MDMA, I found to be is really interesting because in some of the research, it said it helped to dampen, those negative reactions, like in facial expressions. So, those that come from really traumatic, maybe upbringings, they're really sensitive to those nonverbal, maybe facial expressions, and MDMA actually helped to soften that. Just interesting. I'm excited to see where this research goes, and exciting that they're doing it. And as they mentioned, they haven't really been able to research a lot of psychedelics for learning in humans, and so just to see more of this is exciting. And then there's a few quotes here that maybe we'll read off. So LSD enhanced a fundamental learning process, Cannon explained. When something better than expected happened to us, the brain updates our expectations or beliefs about whether something good might happen again if we do the same thing. LSD boosted how rapidly expectations are updated, particularly after better than expected outcomes. And then another quote here. This indicates that LSD may make the brain more changeable. These results could be relevant to potential beneficial effects of people with certain mental health disorders. So again, yeah, thinking about that changeability, that plasticity. And, I'm sure many of you may have heard that analogy of skiing, right? Those grooves that we get into, and how can we change? How can we get out of that same groove when we've just taken the same path over and over again? And I think that's where the potential of psychedelics could lie in. And I know from my own experiences in the past, that was to be true, right? It's like, oh, okay, I get to step outside myself for a little bit and think about things in a new, novel way, and just how important that is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just finally, the piece around the medicine is helpful, but it's kind of what happens afterwards that really, determines what happens with that neuroplasticity. So if I'm not making any changes or trying anything new, then or having more positive influences, more integration work, or positive behavioral patterns and routines like exercise and diet and friends and socializing, or journaling or meditation or yoga, those kinds of things I think have their mental health outcome benefits for sure, but they just start to help us have a way of expressing and exploring, well, who am I? Yeah. Who do I want to become? What's my body feeling like it needs? And just to explore that kind of language with new parts of ourselves, and definitely with our body more. I think our brain, once it opens up, helps us to connect more with our body, and our body holds so much wisdom we pretty much ignore.
Yeah. Yep, we ignore it on a day-to-day basis for the most part.
Right.
And why do we ignore that? And I always think about that. It's like the rational, logistical kind of mind, like our emphasis on logic in our culture versus intuition, right? And there's so much more intuition in the body, but we tend to ignore that because we can't rationalize it or measure it, right? It's like, I have a gut feeling about something. Well, how do you know that? I don't know, I just feel it, right? It's like, well, where's that information? And we get too logical about things, and how do we find a balance there?
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. All right, so we've kind of not got loads of time, but let's jump into the next one. Maybe a quickie. This is saying, federal agency announces $1.5 million in funding for research on psychedelics to treat drug addiction. And that's by Carl Yeager, Marijuana Moment. And it's talking about the federal agency, NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has a very sultry past around psychedelic and drug research, and not being the most objective of funders. So this is, giving $1.5 million to look at the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics for substance use disorder. And it's got, quite a lot of priorities and areas that it wants to go into. It looks like about 8 of them. And, just overall, anecdotally, it's asking good questions, of what we need to know about psychedelics and why are they effective, how are they effective, and how do we kind of, channel that effectiveness. But to me, we kind of know the answers to a lot of these questions already. And for $1.5 million, you can't do much really at all. And a lot of people have been commenting on social media and Reddit, like, what are they going to do with $1.5 million? Like, it's nothing. It's a drop, and all the other money that's being thrown around. So, I'm thinking, because we've got a lot of these answers already to these questions, why can't we just do, say, a meta-analysis or a literature review rather than new clinical research into this, just to say, well, this is what we've already found. When you look at all the other research studies, these are some of the themes. And it might be because perhaps there is less studies into substance use, there's more into mental health. Although, right. I think that's been corrected a bit more recently. There's some great research happening, around alcohol use disorder in particular. But we already know a lot of these questions. And I just feel like, this is just putting on a couple more years of having to get the answers to these questions to then say, oh, okay, so now let's actually start to look at this more seriously. Do we have that time to wait? So I want to be grateful that they're acknowledging that they need to ask these questions, but at the same time, can we just jump to the next stage, please, and not have to kind of go through all the kind of small talk at the beginning?
Yeah, it was kind of like when one of our teachers was talking to Stan, and he's like, oh, isn't it great all this research is happening? And Stan's comment was, a lot of it's been done before. But again, maybe not up to current scientific standards, not double-blind placebo studies. And, to revisit that with kind of the new science protocols can be important. And, I guess also repeatability, right? If science can repeat things over and over again, that gives us more data to say that this is a valid sort of treatment. But yeah, I agree. And yeah, maybe it is because they're looking specifically at substance use disorder. But 1.5 million, it is really just a drop. It's probably really not that much for research. So some of what they're aiming to look at: neurological changes that lead to improved cognitive and emotional regulation, lasting behavioral changes induced by psychedelics, the role of psychedelic compounds in altering brain networks and circuits, and whether the neuroplastic effect observed in animal studies can be replicated in humans. So NIDA emphasized that this type of research would be necessary to utilize modern neuroimaging and behavioral analytic tools to illustrate that changes are elicited by psychedelics. And some of the questions that they're hoping to answer, and I think, David, you said there's about 8 of them. What specific cognitive constructs relevant to SUD treatment are modulated by psychedelics? What, if any, core changes to neurobiology do these compounds facilitate that account for their wide-ranging clinical potential? How do the underlying network connectivity and task-evoked activation scale or predict the magnitude and duration of the observed effects in psychedelics? What are the roles of psychedelic compounds in altering the dynamics of large-scale brain networks and specific circuits? And what's the relationship to changes? And it's really interesting just thinking about like neuroscience in general. Does brain change always lead to behavior change? And I think these are more kind of questions just for the field of neuroscience, right? I feel like we still don't always know, like, just because it's activating a certain receptor site, is that what's actually causing the effect, right? Or just because a certain part of your brain lights up, does that correlate and cause this thing to happen? So I don't know, I always find the neuroscience I think is important, and maybe I just don't understand it completely, but I don't know, sometimes when I talk to neuroscientists too, and they're just really honest of like, this is a totally new field, sometimes we don't really know, we're just making hypotheses around some of this stuff, but it's where could we put money elsewhere, right? When it comes to research and trying to figure out change and whatnot.
Yeah, and this 1.5 million is asking for new kind of neurological research to happen, and I guess they're premising it that to assume that psychedelics are beneficial for substance use disorders, we need some proof of how it affects kind of neurological networking. And that's part of it, but that's not all of it. That really isn't the cause of people's substance use. A lot of it is trauma, and trauma does live partially in the brain, but elsewhere. And there's just so much else that's not brain focused. So I feel like it's kind of precluding so much of how psychedelics work, and just the whole psychotherapy piece as well. They're not interested in that. They just want to know, oh, show us some proof of how the brain changes, and then we'll believe you. I'm like, just like, oh, come on. Can we just change the model here? Like, they want us to fit into this little narrow conceptual form that doesn't really fit, how psychedelics truly work, or how they can be used amongst a range of other tools to help people.
Yeah. I always come back to something, I believe it was Wilder Penfield. He was an American-Canadian neurosurgeon. But he really, he was doing a lot of kind of brain research and experimenting back in the days, and kind of poking around to see how, the brain reacts to certain stimuli. And one of his observations was that mind lies beyond the brain. And I think our teacher Lenny said that's where Stan got the title for his book, Beyond the Brain, one of his earliest books. But I like that, mind lies beyond the brain. It's saying that, there's more to it than just what's happening in the brain. Could be happening what's in the body, could be happening elsewhere, right?
Yeah. All right, Carl, we didn't do everything, but we did some, and it was really awesome to chat with you today.
Yes. This is a fun episode, and it's always great to be riffing with you here at Psychedelics Weekly. Got to do it more often, but we all also like to switch it up and have this nice little rotating staff of folks here for this show. So, David, this has been fun. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this week. I hope you found this episode helpful. Definitely go check out those articles. Those will be in the show notes. And again, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast or been following us on social medias, please do that and support us here if you like what we're doing. So, wishing everybody a beautiful week whenever you're listening to this, and we'll catch you on the next episode. So, thank you again, David. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone. God bless.